All right. Welcome back, everyone. We're excited that you're sticking with us today. I know it's Friday. I know it's been a long day of education, and we're so grateful that you're here with us today. I am excited to welcome back Lucy Perry, the owner and president of Infection Control Results. Lucy is, with this presentation, going to help you become aware of the challenges in creating a one-directional workflow in order to maintain a separation of clean and dirty areas in the dental sterile processing area. And I know that's so tricky because space is tight. And so I'm excited for Lucy to shed light on ways in which you can be more intentional about separating the clean and dirty sides of your reprocess areas. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome back Lucy Perry.
Hi, everybody. I'm back. We're going to be talking about dental sterile processing workflow for patient safety. And your first question may be, patient safety workflow, really? Yes. And we'll talk about why that is so as we go along. My usual disclaimer, use of name brands is not an endorsement of a product or a device. It's just so you can see different things that I'm trying to explain. The objectives are up on your screen. Describe the requirements for transporting contaminated instruments to the processing area. Explain how to organize a dental sterile processing area to prevent crossover of clean and dirty, and therefore enhance patient safety. Identify how to safely store sterile and clean instruments. So instrument transport, the principles for this are derived from the OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard as well as the Needle Stick Safety and Prevention Act. And these state that sharp devices or sharp items must be transported in a manner that protects the person transporting as well as reduces the potential for contamination of the environment. And very clearly they state that it should be in a rigid or solid container, preferably with a lid. With that said, what do you normally see? Well, a lot of times I'll go to a dental facility and see contaminated instruments being transported in their cassette or on the tray, the tableside tray. Neither of which meets the OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard. Obviously, the cassette, yes, it's enclosed of sorts, but doesn't have a solid bottom or a solid top. Therefore, blood, body fluids could leak through and contaminate the environment or the person carrying it. And then the dental instrument tray this tray is a little bit better, the chair side tray is a little bit better, but it doesn't have a lid. So if you were to trip, fall, somebody bump into you, instruments will go flying and therefore contaminating yourself, the other person, or potentially injuring someone with all the sharp instruments in dental. Some other examples I've seen, if you look on the left-hand bottom, you see the gloved hand holding a container. That meets the spirit, if you will, of the OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard in as much as it has a red lid and it has a biohazard label on it. And we all know that red signifies contaminated, right? It's solid on the top, bottom sides. Nothing can jump out of it. Great. The only problem I have with that would be, how do you clean it? How do you know how to clean that properly? Again, this was purchased, at a grocery store or a retail store somewhere, not intended for medical use. Therefore, there's not going to be healthcare oriented instructions for cleaning and disinfection. It's going to tell you, just wash it in warm soapy water. That's what you would do at home. And these are basically, residential use containers. The orange tray with the lid in the middle was actually what I saw at one practice. They would set this up with sterilized instruments in it prior to the procedure in the pediatric practice, and then post-procedure they would put the dirty instruments outside the peel pouches naturally back into that and transport it back. Now, that technically meets the requirements. It has a lid, the sides are solid, the bottom's solid. However, what it doesn't have is a biohazard label. So what we did to get around that, because this was an excellent way to transport the instruments, was we actually created a laminated sign that they could put inside the tray that, you know, on one side was green and said clean, and the other side was red and said dirty. So when they're transporting dirty instruments, they could put that in there. It's laminated, so it can be wiped off. Those signs obviously wouldn't last forever. There are some commercial products that are created that say clean, and then you peel off the top layer, and it says dirty, and they will pull off of the whatever surface that you attach it to. That's another alternative as well. But we were really trying to be cost conscious with this particular practice, so that's what we came up with. And it was something they could implement right away. They didn't have to wait until somebody ordered it, and then it came in, and they had to instruct everybody how to use it. This was a quick and dirty solution to a problem. The ideal, of course, is on the way right-hand side, or one of the ideals, is to obtain transport containers that are meant for that purpose, for healthcare. Now we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty of sterile processing area workflow. So according to the CDC Dental Infection Control Guidelines, the 2003 guidelines, which are the most comprehensive, it talks about receiving, cleaning, and decontamination should be one area separate from prep and pack, sterilization, and storage. These should all be distinct areas within the sterilization area. I do want to comment on the CDC infection control guidelines. They are comprehensive, relatively speaking, because they cover everything in dental infection control from A to Z. However, when it comes to sterilization, they hit on the highlights, truly just the highlights, as does the American Dental Association. You know, they talk about, as Joanne had alluded to, putting chemical indicators inside the peel pouches. And the dental CDC dental infection control guidelines I'm citing here do talk about the separate areas, but they don't help you to get there. They don't give you enough detail of how to get there. A more comprehensive reference would be the AAMI, AAMI, ST79, which is Standard 79, Steam Sterilization in Healthcare Facilities, which does apply to dental as well as medical facilities. And it does actually talk about tabletop sterilizers in there as well, which I know many dental practices use the tabletops. So, workflow. Well, we'll talk ideal first, and we'll talk real. Okay, so ideally, you'd have your dirty part in one room, and then you'd have your clean section where sterilization occurs in the other room. That's the ideal. However, that's not what I see. Usually in dental practices, it's a one-room sterilization room, or sterile instrument room, whatever you want to call it. Frequently, there's only one entrance. It may or may not have a door. Sometimes it's U-shaped or it's a narrow hall. And we'll look at some pictures here. Well, ideally, the workflow should go from dirty to clean. If you have to backtrack, you have a possibility of cross-contamination, of getting your clean items recontaminated. Then you have to reprocess all over again. I want to talk for a minute about automated instrument washers. In dental, this is kind of problematic. Whether it's an ultrasonic, which is all the way over on the right, the two instrument washers are automated. They're a particular brand. They are washers, not washer decontaminators or washer disinfectors. I want to stress that an ultrasonic and some washers only wash. They do not disinfect or decontaminate. By that I mean they do not render the instrument safe for handling with bare hands. This is a key point because it affects your workflow. So here we have a picture of some dental instrumentations. You can see the washer down here below the countertop. On the opposite side in this sterile processing is their sink where they're actually washing their instruments. Because their washer, like the ultrasonic, did not decontaminate, they inspected on the dirty side, or in the dirty area. They also packaged they handled these instruments with PPE, and then they would package the instruments with PPE because they're dirty. The instruments are not dirty, but they're contaminated still. They're not microorganism free. I hate to say free, but they're not decontaminated, okay? In this practice, they would have, once the items were packaged, even on the clean side, they would handle them with gloves until they put them into the sterilizer. Then the gloves were removed, and once the instruments came out, that was the only time you could actually handle them without having to wear PPE. Workflow from dirty to clean. This is from Amy ST79. I kind of borrowed the picture. I want to point out a couple things. This particular picture has one-way workflow, unidirectional. So you would come in, you see the little yellow symbol there. That's for an eye wash station. Follow the arrows to the soiled work area where they actually clean. Go once the instruments come out of this area, either manual wash or mechanically washed, go across to the clean work area, theoretically to prepare and package items, and then put it in the sterilizer and then onto storage. These items would just go, that's how this would go, okay? So you have, and then there's an exit at the other end where it is clean. You want to make sure in your practice that you're not carrying dirty items past sterile, the autoclave or the clean work area or storage. This is another example of an area I went to see, a practice. So when you walk into the room on the right-hand side was their dirty area. This was the scrub sink, if you will, where they would clean their instruments. And they had a small countertop with their chemicals. Then on the to the right of that was another wall where they had their washer. And then across the room on the left were their sterilizers. Now, this washer was not, you can see it's on a table. So there wasn't any countertop there for them to dry their instruments or package them. So what they ended up doing was taking the instruments, extending their dirty area to the right of the sterilizers, designating that area dirty because this washer does not decontaminate or disinfect the instruments. They would still have to wear PPE in that corner of the clean side to prepare, inspect, and package the items, and then they could put them in the sterilizers. This was not the best setup, but given the space that they had, this was probably the best they could do. This is typically what I see sometimes in larger practices. It's kind of like a galley kitchen idea. Notice there are no doors. And usually when I see this setup, what I see is people coming in with dirty instruments from both sides. So there's no unidirectional workflow. This particular design does not help you with unidirectional workflow at all because it's too easy to come in from either side. If your practice is has operatories all the way around the middle, and this is in the middle, everybody tends to kind of want to run in because you're in a hurry. The only solution for this kind of a setup would be to erect a wall, possibly in between the two halves, if one side's clean and one side's dirty. Typically, I don't see this much space devoted to sterile processing of the instruments. When there's a large area like this, typically what I see is on this far side, for instance, would be your sterile processing. A lot of times what I see on this end is a dental lab, which is a whole nother story. All I'll say about if you have this kind of a setup where a dental lab is on one side and you're on the other, you cannot be processing instruments while they are grinding and making dust. That has to be coordinated because while they're grinding and making dust, you cannot take a chance about going through the air and getting onto your instruments, which are then placed in a sterilizer. This is another example of a bad setup. Please note the sterilizer is closest to the door, and you think, oh, good. That way I don't have to carry those dirty instruments past those clean instruments, past the dirty sink, blah, 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 right? But there's only one way in. That's here. So you go in So you have to carry your dirty instruments in past the sterilizer, past the stored instruments to even get to the dirty side. So this is a very bad setup, but it's not at all helpful to even begin to set up unidirectional workflow. This is an example from another facility I went to. This is actually all one. I just didn't do a panoramic, so bear with me. So you'd walk in on this picture, be from your right-hand side. You'd walk past this sterilizer, past this handpiece cleaner, to the dirty sink. Then on the opposite side was the ultrasonic, right next to the two sterilizers, and then storage was on the opposite side. So this is actually what you saw when it was actually in use. So you walked in, instruments would be piled, hand pieces might have been cleaned and sitting here. In this particular practice, they actually had a backtrack. So they would take the hand pieces here to the sink to wash them under running water per the manufacturer's instructions, dry them, put them on the lubricating machine, then let them sit until they were ready to be packaged. Please note, these are cleaned hand pieces sitting right next to dirty instruments. That is great, great, great risk and potential for recontamination of those hand pieces, and you wouldn't even know it. Unfortunately, when organisms jump onto something or are on something, not like anything lights up and lights go off or you hear a bell. You don't know. And of course, one of the principles of sterilization is your instruments have to be clean and as free of organisms as possible, which allows the steam to come into contact with the surface of the item. So if you put something contaminated into the sterilizer, you don't really know that it's really going to be sterile when it comes out. It definitely is a patient safety issue. This is that last one, just a different viewpoint. I wanted to point out a couple more things here. So you have the instrument sink, you have instrument washing sink, you have the ultrasonic with a very wet towel sitting next to it. You have the instrument lubricant, that's what that white stuff is in that container. And the two sterilizers. Please note on top of the small sterilizer, the Statum, you actually have instruments packaged and waiting to go into the sterilizer, sitting right next to an ultrasonic. Ultrasonic, as we know, you will cover it while it's running, but there's always a possibility when you're lifting those instruments out of the ultrasonic that you could spray a little bit perhaps, and you have that still sterile packages right next to it. So that's not the best setup. The only thing I could come up with for this particular practice, because it was so short on space, was to go ahead and put like a plexiglass partition here to at least keep some kind of separation between clean and dirty. Not the best solution, but unfortunately it was the only one we could come up with. We also moved this handpiece cleaner to the other side of the sink, and we moved the ultrasonic over here, which wasn't the best solution, but again, they were very short on space, and that was the best we could come up with. They had to backtrack a little bit from the sink to the ultrasonic, but I felt better about that than backtracking to do handpiece cleaning. So I want to talk a little bit about proximity. Yes, this is a very small area in which everything was jammed into it for instrument processing. The item with the lid on it is an under-counter ultrasonic. Then you have a sink where instruments are washed. So again, they're going kind of backwards-ish from the sink to the ultrasonic, and then they would come over to where she's standing to dry the instruments and inspect them, package them, and then put them in the sterilizers. The instruments that were packaged were very close to the sink. So there's a couple things, or a couple reasons I put proximity on this slide. One was, ideally, you'd have at least 3 feet from the clean side and the dirty side. If you have to be in one room, at least 3 feet. If you can't do that, there should be some kind of partition to prevent splashing, spraying, and contamination of your clean and sterile items. I'm going to spend a minute or two talking about the physical environment. This is from Amy ST79, which I had mentioned earlier. A lot of times I'm asked, well, what about temperature? What about, humidity? Do they matter? What about pressures? What about ventilation? Does all that matter? Yes, it does. The environmental operating parameters in the current Amy ST79 steam sterilization for healthcare facilities standard states, rather than giving you a table of values that you may or may not be able to reach, it states that you should be following the ANSI ASHRAE 170 of the year or the closest year to the age of your HVAC system, or the last time your HVAC system was modified or upgraded. That makes it a little bit easier, a little more practical to meet those standards. Now, with that said, I will remind everybody that the wrappers, the peel pouches, the chemical indicators, the biological indicators, those are the things I can think of offhand. Those kinds of supplies, generally speaking, most of the manufacturers of those products tell you that these items must be stored in a specific humidity and temperature range. So you want to try and meet those to ensure that your sterilization tapes and everything don't just start turning, changing colors because it's too warm where they're being stored. I actually was at a practice where all the sterilization tapes, when they went to use them, had already changed color because their storage area was so hot that that type of indicator only reacts to heat, and it certainly did what it was supposed to. It changed colors. They end up throwing out all their tape, contacting the manufacturer, find out, hey, what's wrong? Learned that, and then was able to store them properly. As far as air pressures are concerned, ideally, again, if you have two separate rooms, one for the clean part and one for the dirty part of decon and prep, pack, and sterilization, decontamination should be negative pressure. The clean side should be positive pressure or positive airflow. If it's one room, the air should flow from clean toward dirty, if at all possible. And I know sometimes it's difficult. So you want to talk to facilities management or your facility manager if you're trying to set up a sterilization area, and so that you know where to place things for the unidirectional workflow. So it's at least you can get airflow from clean to dirty. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about instrument storage. So dental practices are ubiquitous in the fact that they have very limited space for everything. The operatories usually are chock full. This practice had a really good intention. They were trying to store their peel pouches in a manner that didn't squish them. Because if the peel pouches or the wrapper around your cassettes is torn, smushed, for lack of a better word, compressed, then you could potentially have micro tears and introduce organisms into those packages. So it's a very important, storage is a very important part of all this workflow design. In this instance, they had stored their sterile items in this cabinet, if you will. Unfortunately, it's made of cardboard. The whole thing is just cardboard. It was never meant for use in healthcare. So if you are looking for additional storage space, storage items, make sure it's meant for healthcare so that it's a cleanable surface and it can withstand the disinfectants you're going to be using on them. Some more examples of sterile storage areas, in quotes, please. So this was also something I saw. This was like a utility closet that someone stuck shelves in because they needed more space for storage of sterile instruments. there's several things wrong with this picture, but we'll talk first about the biggest thing jumping out at you. This is a piping, for a ventilation system, wrapped in where they have to wrap that stuff in. But this is a filthy, dirty item next to where sterile instruments are stored. And of course, one of the principles of sterile instrument storage is they should be stored in a clean environment. This is anything but that, what you see on your slide. The other part of sterile instrument storage is you want it in an enclosed cabinet, door, drawer, a cabinet with doors on it, or in a drawer to prevent, unintentional or inadvertent contamination of your items. And you also don't want your items handled a lot. The way these cassettes here are stacked, my guess is someone has to root through all this to find exactly what they're looking for. So you're handling continuously all these items. I will point out that this is, the date is on the paper on this. I don't want you to think that's the proper way to do it. That is wrong. The reason for it is the paper side of those peel pouches is what actually lets the steam in. And the manufacturer of peel pouches will tell you, do not write anything, ever, no tape, no nothing on the paper side, because it could potentially interfere with steam penetration. And the steam has to get to every surface of your instrumentation in order for it to be effective and therefore safe for use on patients. This is another example. They really tried hard. They kept their clean and their sterile instruments separate, which is great. What's wrong with this particular picture, for storage at least, is that they have the clean over the sterile. So if you are going to store clean and sterile in the same area, sterile should always be above clean. The other part of this is the gallons of distilled water. These are, of course, tabletop sterilizers that require frequent filling with distilled water. So my concern when I saw this was, I don't know about you. Sometimes I'm really butterfingers, though. I would be concerned that the water could spill. I could drop a gallon, the lid could go flying off, and then all of my stuff, all of my sterile items could potentially become contaminated, which means then I have to unwrap everything, take it over to the dirty side, and completely reprocess. That is a lot of work, a lot of unnecessary work. So my recommendation would be to move this away from anything that could potentially wet it. If nothing else, reverse the cart in this. Now, the reason I'm hesitating is I look at this little storage cabinet. I'll give you a Lucyism. Okay, this is not in the guidelines anywhere. The guidelines say, items should be stored 8 inches off the floor. The reason for that being that so that whoever's mopping can get under it and the floor can be cleaned. That's plus you don't have dust and debris kicking up from the floor, potentially contaminating your items. I'm just not thrilled with this setup at all, and we did come up with something better. If nothing else, in the interim, what we actually did was we moved the cart. We reversed this. We put the cart where this little storage cabinet is and put the storage cabinet to the other side of the cart. Not a great solution, but that's all we could do at the time. This place was really cramped for space again. This is one of my favorite pictures. Again, they're trying really hard. Generally speaking, most peel pouch manufacturers will tell you to store the instruments in the peel pouches on their side, because when you lay them flat, then you could be compressing if you have something heavy. So this dental practice had a good idea of trying to store things on their side, but there's 2 problems here. First is the obvious. They dated everything on paper side, which we just talked about that. But also, the dividers are cardboard. This cannot be cleaned. So anything you're storing anything in healthcare, okay, that container or that bin or whatever should be cleanable, because at some point, periodically, okay, you should be taking everything out of that container or that bin, even if it's sterile instruments, occasionally taking it out, cleaning that bin to make sure there's no dust or debris or anything accumulating in there, and then once it's dry, put the instruments back in. You can't do that with this, with the cardboard dividers. Just a quick reminder, when we talk about the principles of storing sterile items, it applies to all sterile items, not just what you have sterilized in your facility. This is a great example of in an oral surgery practice I went to. I happened to peek into this storage room, and in there was, the monitors, the anesthesia would use, and an endotracheal tube stuffed in this. I actually pulled it out so I could take a picture, but it was stuffed into this little side bin here. And it was all scrunched and mushed up. Myself, personally, I would never use that on a patient, because I would not be assured that that item, that endotracheal tube, is still sterile after it was all smushed and pushed together, and it was kind of folded like a piece of paper, almost in half, and then the ends were all smushed on the side. We threw it out, actually, and they replaced it with something that wasn't smushed. I did mention that sterile storage items should be in closed doors, drawers, something that protects them. Even if you have nothing else, then put it in a bin with a lid. That's better than what you see here. So this was in a practice. This was actually behind the dental chair. As you can see, these items were left out. I mean, this was permanent storage for this practice. So these items were there, patient after patient after patient, potentially the outside becoming contaminated. If the paper side were to become contaminated, it would go through to the instrument. My feeling about that is I wouldn't want those instruments used on me, because I would not be assured of their sterility after they sat there for who knows how long, through how many patient uses, through how many patient procedures or visits. What this practice needed was to either find a way to close this off or install overhead cabinets, so they could actually have something enclosed to put these sterile items in. This is one of my favorites. When I went to this practice, I happened to pull open the drawers, and I saw tons of sterile instruments in peel pouches just kind of in there. This is everything they needed for specialty procedures. This was a very large practice. They did everything under the sun, pretty much. They had all specialties there. So when one of their specialists came to do specific procedures, they'd pull the cart, the entire cart, into the room, pull out what they needed for the procedure. And in this particular instance, the dental assistant told me that there was so short of space in their operatories that they would go ahead and they'd put a barrier on top of that cart and actually put their dental instrument set there, because the dentist didn't have enough space on the opposite side so they could hand the instruments to the dentist. So I don't know if you can see this in the picture, but these are not solid drawers. They're like meshing. Plus, they're not completely enclosed. There's a gap in between every drawer there. So there is plenty of space for spatter and spray to enter those drawers and potentially contaminate those instruments. Again, that's a situation where I wouldn't want those instruments used on me. At a minimum, if they want to use this kind of cart, it should never be taken into an operatory. It's far from ideal. In this practice, I had recommended that they put a cabinet up at the end of the hall where they had room, or even up here, and store their instruments there, and then just, go get what they need and bring them into the room. and do away with the carts, because I felt these carts are definitely a patient safety issue and could be very dangerous. Again, another one of my favorite pictures. So somebody sort of had the right idea here. They are storing the instruments up on end. But if you notice, some of these pouches are folded over, which is a major issue. It could potentially compromise the sterility of the contents. And again, I wouldn't use that instrument on, wouldn't want to use it on there, definitely wouldn't want to use it on a patient. Besides the fact that it's being stored in cardboard. If I don't say this once, I'll say it 100 times. No cardboard for storage, whether it's for partitions or bins, boxes, whatever, no cardboard, only washable surfaces. So this was a place I went to that actually processed instruments for several dental practices. This was just an instrument processing area. It was in the basement of a building, and you can see the door is open here, and you can see what's out there is just general junk. You know, it's files and whatever behind the wire fence. But these black bins is where they stored their clean instruments. They were not sterilized yet, but things that had been washed, like their backup instruments, that's where they stored them. Right next to this dirty corridor where 1 million people walked by. The door, ideally, of course, should be kept closed, but as you can see, it was not. So this is a very, far from ideal storage situation. These instruments were moved from here and put elsewhere, and this was just used as a receiving area after my visit. Again, with the mesh trays. I just wanted you to get a really good view of this. These are items that were sterilized in-house, as well as sterile items supplied by manufacturers, so they come sterile already. So when you talk about sterile storage, it's not just what you've sterilized, it's all your sterile stuff, whether it's burrs or endodontic equipment or whatever you may have. Everything should be stored in the same manner if it's sterile. It should be stored under wraps, so to speak, okay, in an enclosed space, in a clean area. This isn't a hallway where people walk by all day long, and then when they needed something, they'd just open a drawer, grab it, and run. This was very concerning to me. At a minimum, I had recommended, these were, again, specialty carts, and the specialists weren't always there. I had recommended they at least, if at a minimum, if nothing else, the cheapest, easiest thing to do, not the best, but the quickest solution might be just to find covers for these carts and cover the carts so that dirt and debris and everything doesn't get in. However, it doesn't help that if you look here, you see that bottom shelf is very close to the floor. So I had recommended that they empty that bottom, don't use that bottom shelf at all, to help protect the integrity of the other items in the cart, and to replace the items that were in that bottom shelf. Because you didn't know what their condition really was. You know, how clean were they really, being so close to the floor and with people walking by kicking up dust and debris all day. So I just wanted to point this out to you to show you that when you store sterile items in a drawer, it's not like putting your underwear in the drawer, and if they get caught, oh well, you just stick your hand there and fix it, okay? With sterile packaging, again, you don't want it smushed, squished, compressed in any way, mushed up. I don't know how else to put it. There should be no pressure on the packaging, particularly peel pouches, because when you squish it, you could potentially be forcing air out, okay? And one of the issues, I know that a lot of questions I get related to these is that I don't see anything. That, yeah, it was smushed, it was folded over, but it looks fine. My concern has always been not just what you see, but what about what you can't see? You cannot see microorganisms, you cannot see micro tears, and that could be just as deadly to your patient as if there was an overt rip in the package and you used the instrument anyway. Now, I could not speak about storage of sterile items without showing everyone this. This, for me, is a crazy maker, for sure, because I've been saying all along, you know, don't smush, mush, squish, for lack of a better word, your items at all, your sterile items, whether they come sterile from the manufacturer or whether you're sterilizing them yourself. This is an example, a great example of what should not be done. No rubber bands. Because rubber bands put pressure on the outside of the packaging, and you have not just one package, but a bunch. I realized that this practice was trying to keep the dental burrs together in a usable manner, which is understandable, but there are commercial alternatives to rubber bands. There are some manufacturers that make like a ribbon, so to speak, that is cleanable, washable, and reusable, that you can put around your packages that won't put that kind of pressure on it. Alternatively, which I actually think is a much better idea, is just get small bins and, you know, small plastic bins, something that can be cleaned with a disinfectant, and put that set, whatever you're trying to keep together, put that set into that small bin. It could be plastic, it could be metal, the bin itself, whatever works for you. If it's a metal bin, then the advantage to that could be, if the instructions for use are consistent with that, you could potentially take that bin and put it in your ultrasonic periodically, and you don't have to hand clean it, manually clean the bin ever yourself. But I definitely would not. None of these burrs are considered to be sterile now because they've been compressed. That plus, who knows how much pressure is being put on the sides here with those rubber bands. You don't know if it might have small tears in it. So I've kind of thrown a lot at you in a very short time. So where to start? You're thinking, oh my gosh, I've seen some stuff that I don't even know where to begin. Fine, let's talk about that. Walk your space. Go to your practice and follow an instrument from the time it leaves the operatory all the way through the process. And take, you know, if you're visual like me, physically carry an instrument, just yourself, or follow one of your peers if they don't think you're a crazy person, and watch the whole process through. You know, watch someone process instruments. Now, if you're not comfortable with that, or you're like, I don't know, I think something's wrong, but I'm not really sure. You know, I've been doing this here for 15 years. I'm just used to it. Great. Do you have a brand new person at your practice? Preferably somebody who's worked elsewhere, perhaps? Or just maybe a brand new person? If a brand new person, talk to them briefly. You know, somebody new to your practice, talk to them briefly if they don't already know what one-way workflow should be, and have them go through and look at everything, because they'll have a different perspective because they haven't been there for 15 years. They haven't yet built up that, oh my gosh, I don't want to upset anybody, possibly, or I don't want to upset, you know, the dentist because we're changing things, or we're going to tell them this is wrong. The other possibility is you're in a small practice, there's 3 of you working there plus 2 dentists, and there's no extra people, okay? Great. Do you have a colleague at another practice that you're friendly with? Perhaps you could exchange You can have them come over maybe briefly, before hours, after hours, however, whatever works for you, and have them walk your space and help you figure out, is this really one unidirectional? Are things really going from dirty all the way to clean? Am I having to backtrack? And then you could do the same for them. Critically assess your processes. It's really hard to do that, to be critical of a place where you live. I really understand that. I was actually in the military, and I had just transferred in. I was a peri-op nurse, OR nurse. I had transferred into a particular facility to their OR, and I walked in, and I was kind of horrified at some of the things I saw. So I set about, I'm kind of an action person, so I set about trying to fix everything. Do you know, after I had been there for 6 months, I had a hard time identifying what still was wrong. You get normalized. So it's really hard to be critical of your home, your work home. So some things to help you. When you are trying to assess your workflow and decide if it's good, bad, ugly, does it need help or not, you're looking to see during this assessment, is there actual crossover or potential for crossover between the dirty and clean? If you have to backtrack at all, do you have to carry instruments past, dirty instruments past your clean storage area? Do you have to carry those dirty instruments past the sterilizer or the area where hopefully your instruments are cooling after sterilization? If the answer to that is yes, then you do need to really relook at your workflow. Is there enough space to do what you have to do? I know that's an issue. I do feel your pain. If there's not enough space, what can you do to at least give the illusion of more space? I know it sounds crazy. I mean, theoretically, can you, if you have three tabletop sterilizers, is it possible to get like a tall cabinet built for those so you can stack them and give you more counter space? Is that feasible? If there's not adequate space because you have other stuff taking up the counter space, a lot of times what I'll see is one side is dirty and the opposite, and there's like galley type things, the galley type, straight hallway type. One side is dirty and the other side's clean. And the clean side has all kinds of instrumentation out on it, getting ready for the next patient or patients in the operatory. So my question would be, do you really need that much space on the clean side to spread out instruments and extra burrs and things? Can you not put some of that stuff indoors in drawers or cabinets? If you can, then consider moving the sterilizers to that side, because in most dental practices, you're either manually washing instruments only, or else you're manually washing and you're putting them in the ultrasonic. And for those of you who are lucky enough to have a washer, it's just a washer, does not disinfect. So you need extra space on the dirty side to take instruments out of the washer or out of the ultrasonic, dry them, inspect them, package them, and then finally take them over to the sterilizer and sterilize them. Once they come out of the sterilizer, you need some space to put the instrumentation to cool before they go to a patient. And yes, I did see that everybody uses hot instruments chairside, and I know Joanne did talk about that, so I won't belabor that point. You want your workflow to be practical. You could design the most beautiful thing in the world, but if it's not practical for your practice or your facility, no one's going to follow it. Sometimes it helps if you put signage up, clean, dirty. If you're really, really smushed for space and have no other alternatives, and your sterilizers are very close to your sink where your instruments are washed, then at least put up some kind of partition, a washable, cleanable partition to help prevent splashing from those when the instruments are washed. onto your wrapped packages, or worse yet, or just equally as bad, I guess I should say, as you open the sterilizer door and pull your trays out, you don't want, in case you have the luxury of having a second person in steri, you don't want someone washing instruments and potentially splashing and undoing all your hard work, basically. So that's pretty much everything about workflow and storage, from transport to storage. So does anybody have any questions for me?
All right. We actually have a lot of great questions that came through, so I will get started. First and foremost, we got a comment in saying Amy ST79 really drives home your point about do not crush, bend, compress, or puncture. So that's a standard that certainly speaks to the points you made about the rubber bands around the bins, closing them in a drawer, etc. Do you think it's okay for the dental team to lay out your instruments on a Mayo tray prior to your arrival to save time?
I'll assume that means unpackaged. And speaking from the patient's point of view, oh no. Because I, as a patient, you don't know were those instruments even sterilized. Does somebody just kind of rinse them off and pop them on there? You know, it's a patient safety issue, but it's also a perception and an assurance, a patient assurance issue. Most of the recommendations I read in dental recommend not opening instruments until your patient is seated in your operatory and you open everything in front of them. That tells the patient that these items are sterile or prepared just for them. So no, I don't recommend putting anything on a tray prior to the patient coming into the room.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Excuse me, Lindsay, I just want to...
Yeah.
You hit a button with me.
Good. I also explore that. Let's do it.
Also want to stress that although it may be tempting to set up your operatories because you know what your first case is going to be in the morning, what your first procedure is going to be. So, you want to get you leave your cassettes wrapped, but you put them out everywhere. The question I have for you is this. How do you know that cassette that's in a wrapper or those peel pouch instruments are actually sterile when you come in the morning? Now, I know the feeling is, well, nobody's here. But how many practices hire a janitorial service that come in at night? How do you know there's nothing splashed on those items? How do you know they weren't handled with dirty gloves because somebody bumped the tray or the table they were on and went to save them so they wouldn't hit the floor? You don't know that. You definitely want to keep everything under your control when it comes to sterile instrumentation. Okay, thank you. Okay, next question.
Great. Yes, next question. Let's see. Many of the pictures you shared resonated with me because I've seen these practices in the dental processing area that I work in. We're always rushing around, and I'm worried that we have been cross-contaminating as we work around each other. How can I start a conversation with my dental office to make improvements in our workflow? Where should we start?
Without seeing your specific setup, I can't be real specific. So I will give you some general caveats, general suggestions, which is start with something simple. Start with the low-hanging fruit, if you will. Start with something that's the easiest to change. If it's even something as simple as, let's put up a partition next to our instrument sink so we don't have the potential to contaminate the items we're wrapping. Start with that. You might have to ease them into it. The other thing you could do is to actually share some of this information that I've shared with you today, maybe do like a mini in-service to show them what good looks like. Part of the problem that I've seen in dental practices is nobody goes to work in the morning to harm a patient. You go to work to do the best you can to protect your patients, right? You can't do that if you don't know what good looks like. If this is the way it's always been, you accept it because you don't know any different. As we've heard other speakers today, dental assistant schools, dental colleges of dental medicine, dental hygiene colleges or programs, none of those really emphasize much of the information we've covered here today, either myself or the other speakers, unfortunately. So how can you be expected to know this? So please do share the information I've presented today. You've heard from others today as well about workflow design, and maybe start there. But if you have a resistant group, baby steps. Start with something little and easy and kind of ease into it. Okay. Next question.
I love that. This one says, I can really relate with what you said about getting normalized to the work environment. I've been working in my dental office for a number of years, and I think I've gotten used to doing what I have to do to get through the day. I've never done an audit. Can you talk about the walkthrough you mentioned on how to get started with looking for ways to improve? Where would you start with a walkthrough?
Well, for the sterilization workflow walkthrough, well, that's a mouthful, isn't it? For the workflow walkthrough, I would actually, if it's a large enough practice that you have other dental assistants there or RDHs there who would actually be taking the instruments from the operatory to the processing area, and if you have the luxury of having just a few minutes a day, just like 5 minutes, okay? Then take one room. Let's say you're going to take room number 6, and let the RDH or the DA that's in there know, hey, I'm just going to walk with you for a minute. Watch them take those instruments from the operatory to the area, the processing area. You can look at instrument transport. That's a good place to start, okay? Is that safe? Does it meet OSHA requirements? The OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard doesn't cost anything. You can go to OSHA, you can Google OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard, and it'll come up. You can download it. You can read. You can actually search it electronically for instrument handling. I'm trying to think of the exact verbiage, but I know instrument transport's in there. And then you can read to them what it should look like in case you get resistance. Okay, that's one good place to start. So you have 5 minutes on transport. Great. Work on that. Make that your project for improvement. It's easy. It's probably one of the easier ones to fix. And then look at the actual workflow. Follow instruments through. So they're dropped off where? Look at, are they, look at where the instruments are dropped off. Is it next to a sterilizer or next to a dirty sink? Is it next to, are those, like, remember that one picture I showed you with the clean hand pieces were sitting next to that pile of dirty instruments? Well, is that happening in your facility? Do you have clean instruments sitting next to contaminated stuff? That's the kind of stuff you have to look at, just looking at the principles of workflow from dirty to clean. And if you have to backtrack it all, you have to go from clean back to dirty and over to clean again. It's a possibility of cross-contamination. So that's probably the broadest, most specific I can get without knowing your specifics. Okay, Lindsay, next question.
Yes. Can you tell us some aseptic techniques that dental healthcare professionals can apply to limit cross-contamination in sterilization or in the sterile area?
Wow, I could talk for an hour just about that. Okay, let's start with some really simple things. I'll tell you what I've seen and why it's not good. So some simple techniques, okay? So you're going from the operatory into the sterile processing area, dropping stuff off, maybe grabbing some clean stuff, sterile items, and going back to the operatory. Okay. I've also seen, if you're in a practice where kind of everybody does sterile processing, right? As you have time. I love those phrases. That's why the quotes, okay? Because nobody has time. And nobody really wants to do sterile processing. It's kind of a thing you have to do before you can go home. Anyway, what I have seen is people have They have an extra, their patient canceled. They have an extra 15, 20 minutes. They're going to go wash instruments. They will wear the same lab coat or over cover gown that they've just worn in the operatory into sterile processing, clean dirty instruments, and go back to care for a patient. That coat now is grossly contaminated. I know you can't see it. It may not be wet. You may not have splash, but that is gross. That's a grossly contaminated PPE. PPE, ideally, in sterile processing, you would wear PPE devoted just to sterile processing. I didn't go over it very heavily because our speakers earlier today did touch on it. And actually, I think it was the first speaker that really went into detail about the heavy-duty gloves. You know, you shouldn't be wearing the same gloves that you wear in the operatory. Those are some real simple things. Hand washing, hand washing, hand washing. There's never enough. Okay, that's some real simple things to prevent crossover and contamination. And again, you know, look at your workflow.
Okay. All right. Yes, and I'm going to end with this question. We've got a lot of great questions that came through, but we are short on time. This question says, do you think dental industry should adopt other infection prevention and control guidelines, not just the CDC? And if yes, why?
Sure. What a great question. I just love it. Okay. CDC is wonderful. I don't want to downplay them. They are great. They are the pioneers in guidelines, and they're great for as far as they go. They don't know dental. I mean, they have, I don't want to say they don't know dental. They usually have dental personnel involved with the guideline development, but they tend not to be very specific. So if you want to find out more about a topic that's dental specific, sometimes, not always, sometimes you can go to the ADA website, particularly if you're at a dental facility, you have access to a dentist or dentists. I do not because I'm a consultant, but there's a lot of information on the ADA website that you can get to that either says, yes, we agree with CDC guidelines, but here's more information. And I'll give some more examples, perhaps, or more detailed examples. Now, as far as sterilization is concerned, AAMI ST79 is the Bible of guidelines for steam sterilization. It is several hundred pages, which I know nobody must read several hundred pages, but it's a reference. It's not a book, not meant to be read from front to back. It talks about design, workflow, correct steam sterilization processes, and if you should be unfortunate enough to have to do cold chemical sterilization, AAMI ST58 goes into great detail about that as well. And that is why, because the CDC guidelines and sometimes the information provided by ADA just is not granular enough to really help you.
Okay.
Okay, next question.
Wonderful. Lucy, that's actually all the time. I'm so bummed that we're out of time, but thank you so much for sharing your insights today. Thank you. We've got a lot of great comments saying thank you for showing pictures. Pictures are worth 1,000 words in some cases, and this was no exception. So thank you for joining us twice today. We're very grateful for your time. Thank you to everyone who's still tuned in. The last session is coming up in about 12 minutes. And if you have time, grab some water, grab a snack, do whatever you need to do, and join us for the final session of today's Brushing Up on Quality Dental Reprocessing Conference. We're glad you're here, and we're in the home stretch, everybody. So we'll see you in the next session.